Imagine the smell of rotting animal flesh just sitting out in the hot sun.
Oh man, that is not a pleasant picture to start with.
No, it's really not.
Mm.
But stick with me here. Picture massive stone vats, right? And they are filled with burning caustic chemicals.
Just bubbling away.
Yeah. And think of a laborer standing over a curved wooden board. He's holding this crescent-shaped knife, spending 10 hours a day meticulously scraping hair and fat off a raw animal hide.
And if he messes up?
If he presses just a fraction of an inch too hard, he slices right through the skin. He ruins a whole week's worth of wages in 1 second.
That is immense pressure.
It is. And that brutal, foul-smelling, physically exhausting scene, that is the actual historical origin of the physical book you might carry into church on a Sunday morning. Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here.
Today we are taking a thorough deep dive into how the New Testament was made, copied, and preserved. Our mission here is to shatter a very common myth.
The golden tablet myth.
Spot on. The idea that the Bible was just beamed down from the sky, pre-bound in premium leather with those nice gold-edged pages, and simply handed to the apostles.
Right, because when people look at ancient history, they often want it to be, sterile. They want the artifacts to sit quietly under 3 inches of temperature-controlled museum glass.
Completely untouched by human hands.
Yeah, but that's not the reality. The historical grit is where the true narrative lives. We're looking at ordinary dirt, plant fibers, animal skins, and just immense human labor.
And looking at the wear and tear of ancient bookmaking, or the chemical processes of ink, or even the slips of human scribes that doesn't weaken the theological claims of the text.
No, quite the opposite. It displays the sovereign method chosen to safeguard the word. The theological premise we're operating from here is that God immediately inspired the autographic text, right? But he chose to use physical, historical, and highly decentralized means to keep it pure across all ages.
I love that. So I want to start right at the physical beginning.
Yeah.
Because before we can talk about the words themselves, we have to talk about what those words were actually written on.
The physical substrates.
Yeah. I mean, in the first century, you don't have digital clouds, you don't have printing presses, you don't even have paper as we know it today. So what were the raw materials of Revelation?
Well, the primary writing material for the ancient Mediterranean world was papyrus.
Okay, papyrus.
And this was an industry completely centralized in Egypt because it relied entirely on the cypress papyrus plant.
Which is a specific type of reed, right?
Yeah, a tall triangular reed that grew abundantly in the shallow, marshy regions of the Nile Delta. There is actually a nod to this specific geographical requirement in the book of Job.
Oh, really? What verse?
Chapter 8, verse 11. It asks if papyrus can grow where there is no marsh. And the answer is obviously no. It needed that specific, wet Egyptian environment to thrive.
So a scribe living over in Rome or Ephesus can't just walk out to his backyard and cut down a papyrus plant.
Not a chance. This was a highly specialized import.
But how do you go from a green, marshy reed to a flat sheet you can actually write a letter on? I mean, what is that process?
The manufacturing process was entirely manual and, frankly, highly meticulous. Ancient workers would wade into the Nile, harvest these massive stalks, and bring them ashore.
And you can't just write on the outside of the plant, can you?
No, the outer layer is this tough green rind. That has to be stripped away completely. What they were after was the inner pith, which is a soft, ivory-white substance.
Wow. I am picturing the sheer repetitive labor of this. You have workers standing in the heat of the Egyptian sun, stripping thousands of these reeds by hand all day long just to get to the center.
That is the harsh reality of ancient production. Once they extracted that white pith, they would take a sharp blade and slice it into very thin, narrow ribbons.
Okay.
Then they took a flat wooden board and laid these ribbons side by side, running vertically, slightly overlapping them.
Like weaving a basket.
Kind of, but without the over and under part. Because then they took a second layer of ribbons and laid them horizontally across the first layer at a direct right angle.
Building a literal grid out of plant strips.
A very precise grid. After arranging the layers, the workers took a heavy mallet and physically beat the plant fibers together.
Smashing them.
The papyrus plant naturally contains a sticky, sap-like juice. Under the severe pressure of the beating, that juice is forced out of the fibers and acts as a natural glue.
Oh, that's fascinating. So the plant glues itself together?
Yeah, it fuses the vertical and horizontal layers into a single unified sheet. They would leave it to dry in the harsh sun, and finally, polish the surface with a piece of ivory or a rounded stone.
To make it smooth.
Right, to create a surface smooth enough to accept ink without bleeding all over the place.
But that crisscross manufacturing method, that creates a very specific quirk for the person actually doing the writing, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You end up with two completely different textures on the front and back of the sheet.
Break that down for us.
Well, the front side of the sheet is known as the recto. Because of how the strips were laid, the fibers on the recto run horizontally.
Which sounds pretty convenient.
It was highly desirable for a scribe. Those horizontal lines acted like natural ruled paper, guiding the pen straight across the page.
But the backside is different.
The backside is the verso. On the verso, the fibers run vertically.
So you are writing against the grain.
Exactly. Or, spot on, if you are dragging a reed pen across vertical bumps, your ink is going to splatter. The pen is going to catch. It will be a completely miserable experience.
I can imagine. So they just avoided the backside.
Mostly, yeah. The verso was rarely used for continuous formal writing unless the scribe was trying to save money.
Which makes sense. So papyrus was relatively inexpensive compared to the alternatives, and it was highly serviceable.
Mm-hmm.
But it possessed a massive structural flaw, didn't it?
It did. It is basically dried plant matter held together by its own sap.
Right.
So if you take that out of the bone-dry climate of Egypt and bring it to a damp, humid environment, it degrades rapidly, it will rot, or it will become extremely brittle and crack into pieces. Papyrus requires an arid climate to survive.
Which is a huge problem if the church is spreading across the entire Mediterranean.
Exactly. This fragility, combined with some intense geopolitical issues, forced a major shift in our timeline.
Right.
The shift away from plants and toward animal skins.
The shift to parchment.
Yes.
How does that transition happen? I imagine people didn't just wake up one day and decide they wanted to go through the horrific process of turning a cow into a book unless they were totally forced to.
They were forced to by economics and political rivalry. Historians trace the large-scale adoption of parchment to the city of Pergamum.
Located over in Asia Minor, right?
Yes. Under the rule of King Eumenes II, the rulers in Egypt placed a strict embargo on the export of papyrus. They completely cut off the supply chain.
Wow. So Pergamum has a massive library they're trying to build, and suddenly they have absolutely no paper.
They had to innovate, and their innovation relied on livestock. Parchment is made from the skins of young calves, sheep, and goats.
And the manufacturing process, as we alluded to at the top of the show, is absolutely grueling.
It is a severe chemical and mechanical process.
Walk us through that. A farmer slaughters a calf. How does that skin become a pristine white page for a Bible?
First, the parchment maker takes the raw, bloody animal skin and submerges it in massive stone vats. These vats are filled with a liquid called slaked lime.
Slaked lime. That's a chemical, right?
A highly caustic, alkaline solution. The skin sits in this chemical bath for several days. The purpose of the slaked lime is to chemically break down the hair follicles and begin dissolving the excess fat.
Ah, so that is the terrible smell I brought up earlier. Vats of rotting hide and caustic chemicals sitting out in the sun.
It would have been pungent enough that parchment makers usually had to operate on the outskirts of town. You didn't want to live next door to this guy.
Definitely not. So what happens after the chemical bath?
After the skin soaked for days, the worker pulled the wet, heavy pelt out of the vat and draped it over a curved wooden post. This is where the mechanical labor begins.
The scraping.
Yeah. The worker used a specific tool called a lunellum. This was a double-handled knife shaped like a crescent moon.
Why a crescent moon shape? I mean, why not just use a standard straight blade?
Because a straight blade has sharp corners. If you are aggressively scraping a wet hide with a straight blade, the corner can easily catch the skin.
And tear it.
Right, slice a hole right through it and completely ruin the parchment. The crescent shape of the lunellum allowed the worker to apply massive downward pressure, scraping away the hair and the flesh, without the risk of a sharp corner snagging the material.
That makes total sense. So they're aggressively scraping this hide clean, but it's still just wet leather at this point, isn't it?
To turn it into parchment, it must dry under immense physical tension. The worker took the scraped pelt and suspended it inside a large wooden frame.
Okay.
They attached cords to the edges of the skin and pulled them incredibly tight, stretching the hide in all directions.
Kind of like tightening the head of a snare drum.
Spot on, like a drum. As the wet skin dried in the sun while under that extreme tension, something fascinating happens at a microscopic level.
What happens?
The collagen fibers inside the animal skin are physically forced to align themselves into parallel layers. That alignment is what gives parchment its incredible toughness.
Wow. I had no idea it changed structurally like that.
It does. And once it was completely dry and taut, the worker would plane the surface with a pumice stone to rough it up and then rub chalk powder into the surface.
What does the chalk do?
The chalk absorbs any remaining grease and gives the skin that brilliant, opaque white finish.
So that is an insane amount of work. So now, after all this horrific manual labor, you have a writing surface that is virtually indestructible.
I can handle decades of active daily reading.
And unlike papyrus, you can write on both sides with no vertical grain to fight against.
Exactly.
But surely you can't use the same ink on dense anima skin that you used on a porous plant sheet, right?
You really can't. The chemistry of the ink had to evolve right alongside the material. On papyrus, ancient scribes used carbon ink.
What's carbon ink made of?
It was a very simple mixture of lampblack, which is essentially collected soot or charcoal mixed with gum arabic and water.
Basically soot and tree sap.
Yes. On papyrus, carbon ink works beautifully because the fibrous plant material absorbs the ink. It sinks in.
But parchment is completely different.
Completely. The stretching and the chalking create a very smooth, dense surface. If you write on parchment with carbon ink, the ink just sits on top of the surface.
Like a dry erase board.
Very similar. Once it dries, you could literally lick your thumb and wipe the words right off the page. It just flakes away.
Wow. So to fix that, they had to invent something that would actually penetrate the hide. And they developed iron gall ink.
They did.
And the recipe for this ink is one of the most bizarre things in ancient chemistry. You start with something called oak gall tumors, right?
Yes. Oak galls are spherical growths that form on the branches of oak trees. They occur when a specific type of wasp pierces the branch and lays its eggs inside the tree.
Okay, that is wild. The tree recognizes the wasp egg as a foreign invader, and its immune system reacts by building a hard, tannin-rich tumor entirely around the egg to quarantine it.
That's the biological process. So ancient ink makers would go out into the forests and harvest these wasp tumors from the trees.
I just love that image. Harvesting wasp tumors to write the Bible.
It's incredible. They would crush the oak galls into a fine powder. This powder is packed with tannic acid and gallic acid.
And then what?
They took that acidic powder, mixed it with rainwater, and then added a chemical compound called ferrous sulfate. In the ancient world, they called this copperas.
And this isn't just mixing colors together like standard paint, is it?
No, when you combine tannic acid from a wasp tumor with ferrous sulfate, you trigger a violent chemical reaction.
A reaction that changes the color.
Dramatically. When that liquid hits the parchment page and makes contact with the oxygen in the room, it immediately turns from a pale, watery brown into a deep, permanent, dark black.
That is just brilliant. But the real key is how it interacts with the parchment, right?
Because the iron gall ink is highly acidic, it doesn't just sit on the surface. It bites directly into the collagen fibers of the animal hide.
It's an ancient chemical tattoo.
That is a great way to put it.
You're not just painting words on a page, you are physically scarring the message into the skin of the parchment.
Which means the writing is practically permanent. The only way to remove it is to take a blade and physically shave off the top layer of the animal skin.
Which is pretty drastic. So that durability is why iron gall ink became the absolute standard.
It ensured that texts meant to be handled, debated, and read aloud in public assemblies would actually survive the heavy usage.
But as with any technological advancement, human nature found a way to turn it into a status symbol, didn't it?
Oh, of course. When you have a tough, premium material like parchment, people with money want to show off.
The luxury editions. We see historical records of Bibles being produced on parchment that had been dyed entirely in a deep imperial purple.
And the scribes didn't use standard iron gall ink for those. They wrote the entire text using liquid gold and silver ink.
Which sounds beautiful, but maybe a bit excessive for a church struggling under persecution.
We actually have letters from early church leaders heavily condemning this practice, specifically Jerome, who was a brilliant biblical scholar.
What did Jerome say about it?
Jerome argued that a purple-dyed manuscript with gold lettering completely distracted the reader from the actual text.
He wasn't a fan of the bling.
Not at all. He viewed it as an arrogant display of wealth that obscured the purity of the sacred writings.
He wanted the stark contrast of black ink on plain white parchment.
Right. He wanted the focus to remain on the theological truth of the words, not the financial status of the man holding the book.
I think that's a brilliant point. So we have the raw materials down. We understand the plant fibers, the animal skins, and the acidic tattoo ink.
The building blocks.
Yeah. But physical materials always dictate the structural format of the final product. we have to look at the massive physical limitations these materials imposed.
And the technological revolution the early church initiated to overcome them.
Let's look at the classical Greco-Roman world first.
Yeah.
What was the standard format for publishing any major literary work?
Whether it was philosophy, history, or poetry, the standard was the volumen, which we know today as the scroll.
So a scroll maker would take those individual sheets of papyrus we talked about, glue them together edge to edge, and form a long, continuous strip.
And then attach that strip to a wooden roller.
But there is a severe physical limit to how big a scroll can get before it becomes completely useless.
A standard Greek literary scroll maxed out at about 35 feet in length.
35 feet is the structural ceiling.
Yeah. If you try to glue together 50 feet of papyrus, the resulting roll becomes incredibly thick, extremely heavy.
And the sheer tension of rolling and unrolling it will cause the glued seems to snap.
It would just fall apart in your hands.
Because of this strict 35-foot limit, long continuous texts faced a massive logistical problem.
Think about the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts.
Right. Thematically and chronologically, they are a single, continuous, two-part narrative written by the exact same author.
But structurally, they could not fit on a single standard papyrus scroll. The author had to physically split the narrative into two separate volumes entirely because of the physical limits of the material.
That blows my mind. The medium literally dictated the division of the biblical books.
It did. And beyond the capacity issues, the scroll was remarkably inefficient for the reader.
Think about the physical act of reading a 35-foot scroll. You can't hold it with one hand. You need both hands just to operate the mechanism.
You're holding the wooden roller in your right hand, slowly unwinding the text,
While your left hand is frantically rolling up the slack so the papyrus doesn't drag on the dirt floor.
It's a workout. And if you are studying the text, navigation is an absolute nightmare.
Say you're reading in chapter 2 of a scroll, and you suddenly realize you need to check a cross-reference located in chapter 24.
You have to manually crank through 30 feet of papyrus, find the reference, and then crank all the way back to chapter 2.
The labor involved heavily discourages comparative study. You just wouldn't do it unless you had to.
Which is why the shift to the codex is such a monumental moment in history.
Let's talk about the codex. The codex is the leaf-form book. It is the exact architecture of the books sitting on our shelves today.
You take sheets of papyrus or parchment, stack them, fold them down the middle, and sew them together along a central spine.
And the early Christians adopted this codex format incredibly early, didn't they?
By the early 2nd century. While the rest of the Roman Empire is still heavily relying on scrolls, the Christians are almost exclusively utilizing the codex.
That's a massive cultural pivot. Why did they do it?
The economic advantages alone were staggering.
The math on this is fascinating. Because the codex format allows you to easily turn pages, you can comfortably write on both sides of every single leaf.
You utilize both the recto and the verso without the physical awkwardness of a scroll.
And the data shows this yielded a 44% savings in the sheer amount of papyrus required.
And a 26% savings in overall production costs.
For a marginalized, often persecuted religious minority composed largely of lower-class citizens, that economic efficiency was absolutely vital.
They could produce more copies for far less money, but the economics alone don't explain the rapid adoption.
That is the big question I have. If pagan classical literature, the great esteemed works of Homer, Aristotle, and Plato, stayed on traditional scrolls for centuries, why were the early Christians the technological early adopters of the codex?
Why abandon the traditional Roman scroll so decisively?
Yeah, why?
It comes down to the principle that form follows function. The theological needs of the early church demanded a different physical architecture. Well, the codex allowed for vastly greater physical capacity. For the first time in history, you could bind all 4 Gospels together in a single portable volume.
Or place all of Paul's letters between 2 covers.
That structural unity reflects their theological view of a unified canon. And practically speaking, it suited a people who were constantly engaged in apologetic and theological debates.
Picture this. A Christian is arguing with a critic in the town square. The critic quotes an Old Testament prophecy from Isaiah.
The Christian apologist needs to instantly flip to the Gospel of Matthew to show the historical fulfillment.
And you can't do that swiftly with a scroll. You'd be cranking papyrus for 5 minutes.
But the codex allowed for rapid, nonlinear navigation. You just turn the page.
So functional necessity drove the technological shift.
It did. And this shift was permanently cemented into the culture in the year 331 AD by Emperor Constantine.
What did Constantine do?
Following his legalization of the faith, Constantine sent an imperial order to Eusebius. He demanded the production of 50 high-grade, complete parchment Bibles for the newly constructed churches in the capital city of Constantinople.
50 complete Bibles, entirely on premium animal skin. The sheer logistics of that order, the number of calves that had to be slaughtered, the vats of slaked lime, the gallons of iron gall ink, it's just mind-boggling.
It was a massive imperial undertaking, and we still possess surviving monuments from this exact era that give us a glimpse of what those imperial codices looked like.
Like what?
We have Codex Vaticanus, which is beautifully formatted with 3 neat columns of text on every page, and Codex Sinaiticus, which features 4 columns per page.
4 columns per page. That must be huge.
When you look at these massive, heavy parchment codices, you are looking at the absolute pinnacle of ancient book architecture.
So we have the architecture built. We have the parchment pages stretched, cut, folded, and sewn into a codex.
The physical vessel is ready.
Now we have to look at the actual manual transfer of the text. We have to walk inside the scriptoriums, look at the men holding the pens, analyze their handwriting, and confront the human error that naturally comes with this grueling process.
Because the environment of the copying room directly caused the specific types of variations we see in the manuscripts today.
Let's start with the handwriting itself.
The formal study of ancient Greek handwriting is known as paleography. When paleographers examine New Testament manuscripts, they divide them into 2 primary script styles.
What's the first one?
The first is called majuscule, which is also referred to as uncial script. This was the dominant, exclusive style from the time of the apostles all the way until the 9th century.
Majuscule is essentially large, formal, block capital letters.
Yes, very grand and imposing.
But the brutal part for the reader is that they wrote it using a system called scriptio continua, right?
Yes, that means there were absolutely no spaces between the words.
None at all.
0. There were no commas, no periods, no paragraph breaks, and no accent marks. Just a solid, unbroken wall of capital letters from the top left margin to the bottom right.
It looked aesthetically majestic on the page, but it was incredibly inefficient.
Because the letters were so large, you could only fit a small amount of text on a page, which meant you consumed vast quantities of expensive parchment to copy a single book.
And think about the mental strain of actually reading scriptio continua. Imagine trying to read a modern website URL where all the letters of the domain name are smashed together without spaces.
It slows you down to a crawl.
Now imagine reading an entire 400-page novel formatted exactly like that. A modern reader gets frustrated if a web page takes 3 seconds to load. An ancient reader had to spend an hour staring at a single parchment page, vocalizing the syllables out loud, just to figure out where one word ended and the next verb began.
This severe inefficiency eventually provoked a major paleographical reform. In the 9th century, Abbot Theodore the Studite, operating out of the Studium Monastery in Constantinople, helped popularize and formalize the minuscule script.
Minuscule completely changed the game.
It was a smaller, compact running hand. The letters were connected, similar to cursive.
But the real breakthrough was that the scribes finally introduced word divisions and standard punctuation.
By transitioning to minuscule, scriptoriums slashed their production costs. The contact letters meant a scribe could fit significantly more text onto a single sheet of parchment.
It also drastically increased the physical speed of the copying process, which allowed the monasteries to mass produce and distribute the scriptures much faster.
But whether a scribe is painstakingly drawing majuscule block letters or quickly scratching out minuscule cursive, we have to talk about the physical room where this happens.
How did a text actually get duplicated before the printing press?
Well, once the era of Roman persecution ended, the copying moved into professional centers known as scriptoria. The process in a scriptorium was highly regimented.
Set the scene for us.
You would have a large room filled with wooden benches. Multiple trained scribes would sit at these benches, each with their own blank parchment codex, a pen, and an inkwell.
And at the front of the room stood a man called the lector, or the reader.
The lector holds the master copy, the exemplar. He stands at the front and reads the text aloud, very slowly, syllable by syllable, while 20 scribes write down exactly what they hear.
It is a brilliant ancient method for mass production. You read the book once, and you instantly generate 20 copies.
But relying on human hearing introduces a very specific category of error.
We call these auditory errors.
Right.
When you are sitting in a room, copying a text entirely by ear, words that sound similar can easily be swapped.
Paleographers track a specific phonetic phenomenon called itacism. Over the centuries, the standard pronunciation of several different Greek vowels and diphthongs shifted.
They converged so that they all sounded absolutely identical to the human ear.
Right. The letters eta, iota, upsilon, and the two-letter combinations of epsilon iota, omicron iota, and upsilon iota. By the time of these scriptoria, every single one of those different spellings was pronounced exactly like the English E.
So the lector stands at the front and calls out a word with an E sound. The scribe sitting at the bench hears the sound, but he has to guess which of the 6 possible spellings is grammatically correct based on the context of the sentence.
And human beings get tired. Sometimes they simply guess the wrong spelling.
And auditory errors weren't the only issue. Sometimes a scribe wasn't in a large room listening to a lector. Sometimes a scribe was sitting alone at a desk, looking directly at an open master copy and copying it visually onto his own blank page.
Visual copying introduces mechanical eye errors. A common example is homoteluton,
which translates to similar ending.
Imagine a scribe is copying a dense paragraph. He writes down a line, looks back up at the master copy, and his eye searches for his place.
Okay, I can picture that.
If 2 adjacent lines happen to end with the exact same Greek word, the scribe's eye might naturally jump from the end of the first line to the end of the second line.
He resumes writing, completely unaware that he just skipped an entire sentence in between.
There's also homoarcton, which means similar beginning. 2 lines start with the exact same sequence of letters.
The scribe looks down to dip his pen in the iron gall ink, looks back up at the page, catches the second line instead of the first, and accidentally drops a phrase. Hold on, let me ask the question everyone is thinking when they hear this.
Go ahead.
You're telling me we have an ancient system where tired men are sitting in noisy rooms, guessing how to spell words based on E sounds, or sitting alone and accidentally skipping entire sentences because their eyes glazed over. Doesn't this mean these ancient texts are absolutely riddled with mistakes?
How can anyone trust a book produced this way?
Yeah.
That is the standard skeptical reaction, but it misunderstands the nature of the data. Knowing the specific mechanical cause of these errors is precisely what makes them highly detectable.
Detectable how?
Because modern textual critics understand the phonetic shifts of itacism and the visual mechanics of homoteluton, they can spot those specific errors almost instantly when they compare 2 manuscripts side by side.
The errors are predictable.
Yes, which makes them reversible. It provides a reliable diagnostic tool to recover the original reading.
And it is crucial to balance the reality of human fatigue with the reality of their intense theological reverence.
These scribes were not copying a secular accounting ledger or a shipping manifest.
They viewed this text as sacred, and you can physically see their devotion carved into the ink.
A prime example of this devotion is the scribal system of nomina sacra, or sacred names.
Yeah.
Very early on, Christian scribes developed a strict practice of contracting specific divine titles.
When they encountered words like God, Lord, Jesus, or Christ, they treated them differently than normal vocabulary.
Instead of writing the full word out, they would write just the first and last letters of the name. Then they would draw a solid, bold, horizontal line right over the top of the contraction.
This practice was astonishingly consistent across vastly different geographic regions. It functions as a physical, visual witness to the high Christology of the ancient church.
It proves that the copyists held these specific names to be uniquely sacred, deliberately separating them visually from every other mundane word on the parchment page.
They revered the text, but occasionally they were forced into heartbreaking situations by sheer economic desperation.
That leads us to the phenomenon of palimpsests.
A palimpsest is a re-scraped parchment sheet, right?
Yes. In periods of severe economic depression, when a monastery simply could not afford to purchase fresh animal skins, a scribe might go into the library, find an old, worn-out manuscript, wash the pages, scrape off the existing ink with a pumice stone, and reuse the expensive hide to write a completely new text.
Codex Ephraemi Scriptus is the famous example of this.
A massive example.
In the 5th century, this was a majestic, highly valuable, unsocial Bible. But fast forward to the 12th century, a scribe needs parchment.
So he takes this 5th century Bible, violently scrubs away the scriptures, and writes a series of theological sermons by a man named Ephraim the Syrian right over the top of the erased pages.
To the naked eye, the Bible was gone. But earlier, we discussed how acidic iron gall ink bites deep into the collagen fibers of the hide.
Even when the surface ink is mechanically scraped away, a microscopic chemical residue remains permanently embedded in the skin.
So how do we read it today?
Using modern multispectral imaging technology, scientists blast these pages with specific wavelengths of light. This allows them to look completely through the 12th century sermons and read the glowing chemical ghost of the 5th century of biblical text underneath.
It is a stunning recovery of history.
It really is.
So we have all these codices. They're filled with text, copied with reverence, bearing the marks of human fatigue, and sometimes even scraped and rewritten.
But because the text was now bound into these large, heavy books, early Christians needed robust tools to study and preach from them effectively.
You can't just hand a 500-page block of continuous text to a pastor and expect him to find a specific parable during a Sunday service.
This brings us to the invention of the ancient search engines.
Search engines in the ancient world.
Once the individual scrolls were gathered into a unified codex, the need for structural navigation aids became critical. Readers required systems to locate specific narratives for public reading and comparative theological study.
Scribes began augmenting the margins with reader accessories. They started dividing the continuous text into distinct chapters, which they called kephalia.
But they didn't just drop a number in the margin, they added titloi. These were short, highly descriptive summary headings written directly into the top or side margins.
To make these navigation aids visually distinct from the main text, scribes frequently wrote the titloi in vibrant red ink.
Furthermore, they would compile a master list of all these summary headings and place it at the very beginning of the codex.
Essentially inventing the structured table of contents.
Yes. If a reader needed to locate the narrative of the feeding of the 5,000, they didn't have to blindly skim the entire gospel.
They checked the table of contents, found the corresponding red heading, and flipped directly to that page.
But the absolute peak of ancient navigation technology was the Eusebian canons.
Constructed in the 4th century by Eusebius of Caesarea, is a breathtakingly sophisticated cross-referencing system.
Eusebius recognized a unique structural challenge in the New Testament. The 4 Gospels share many parallel accounts, like the baptism of Jesus or Peter's denial.
But each author presents them in slightly different orders and contexts.
To harmonize this, Eusebius undertook a massive analytical project. He read through all 4 Gospels and manually divided them into small, numbered sections based on individual events.
Matthew was divided into 355 sections, Mark into 233, Luke into 342, and John into 232.
Think about the pure intellectual labor required to do that. He doesn't have a computer. He doesn't have a printed concordance.
He is sitting in a room with 4 different unrolled manuscripts, reading a paragraph in Matthew, holding his place with his finger, physically unrolling the scroll of Mark to see if the same story is there, writing down a number, and then checking Luke.
Once he had categorized every single event with a margin number, he created a physical algorithm.
He built 10 index tables, which he called the canons.
These tables were usually bound at the very front of the codex, often framed by beautiful architectural drawings of columns and arches in red and gold ink.
And the logic of the tables is brilliant.
The first canon table contained a grid listing the section numbers for every event that appeared in all 4 Gospels simultaneously.
The second table listed events shared only by Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
The tables logically progressed through every possible combination until the 10th canon, which simply listed the events that were completely unique to each individual gospel writer.
So how does a reader actually use this ancient algorithm? Say you are reading the Gospel of Matthew and you see a tiny red number written next to the paragraph about the temptation in the wilderness.
You keep your finger on that page in Matthew, flip to the front of the codex to the canon tables, find that specific red number inside the grid, and instantly the table provides the exact margin numbers for the parallel accounts in Mark and Luke.
You can instantly jump to those pages and analyze how the different authors describe the exact same event.
It is incredibly efficient.
I have to pause here because this blows my mind. The early Christians essentially invented the study Bible and the hyperlink search engine.
They absolutely did.
This proves they were not just reading the text for a subjective, mystical, emotional high, letting the words wash over them in a trance.
Well, they built complex mathematical grids and navigational indexes because they valued rigorous, analytical, comparative study of the text.
That analytical, structured approach extended to several other study tools that scribes developed over the centuries. They began attaching hypotheses to the front of the books.
These were concise introductions detailing the traditional authorship, the date of composition, and the historical occasion that prompted the letter.
They added bioi, which were brief biographical sketches of the evangelists.
For the massive, complex sections like the Book of Acts and the Epistles of Paul, they circulated the Euthalian apparatus.
What's that?
This was a heavy collection of reference materials that included complete, exhaustive lists of every single time the Apostle Paul quoted an Old Testament verse, along with geographical tables mapping out the specific cities and regions associated with his missionary journeys.
And as the corporate worship services of the ancient church became highly structured, scribes began writing lectionary markings directly into the margins of the biblical manuscripts to guide the pastor.
They would write a small red abbreviation for arch, meaning beginning, to mark the exact starting point for the week's public reading.
And a red abbreviation for telos, meaning end, to signal where the pastor should stop reading.
All of this intense labor, the copying, the indexing, the cross-referencing, the distribution across the empire, resulted in an absolute mountain of physical manuscript evidence.
And that mountain forms the bedrock of our historical confidence in the text today. This brings us to the theological genius of decentralized preservation.
The sheer, staggering volume of manuscript evidence for the New Testament is without parallel in the ancient world. Today, paleographers and textual critics have cataloged over 5,700 individual Greek manuscripts of the New Testament.
Over 5,700. Let's break down those categories because they represent different eras and formats. First, you have the papyri.
There are over 116 of these cataloged. These are mostly fragmented sheets from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, giving us our earliest, rawest glimpses into the transmission of the text.
Then you transition to the majuscules. There are over 310 of these.
These are the large, formal, uncial Bibles written on high-grade vellum, representing the complete or near-complete codices of the 4th through the 8th centuries, like Vaticanus and Sinaiticus.
Next are the minuscules, utilizing that compact, efficient running hand we discussed. There is a massive spike here, 2,877 of these, mostly representing the Byzantine era of transmission from the 9th century onward.
Finally, there are the lectionaries. We have over 2,432 of these.
These are the archaic liturgical texts. They contain the scriptures, but they are arranged out of canonical order, reorganized strictly by the reading schedule of the ancient church calendar.
Let's put that massive 5,700 document textual cloud into perspective for a modern reader.
If you study the surviving records of secular classical authors, historians like Tacitus or Villius Paterculus, their entire literary survival often hangs by a thread.
We are frequently relying on a single, damaged, late medieval copy to know what they wrote, one single document.
But the New Testament is supported by a massive woven cable of thousands of distinct, geographically separated documents.
There is a deep structural reason for this massive volume. The historical data argues that this decentralized method of transmission was the deliberate genius of divine preservation.
It is a safeguard against corruption.
Exactly.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of that. Why is a decentralized mess of thousands of copies better than having one perfectly preserved master copy sitting in a museum vault?
Consider the alternative. Imagine if God had preserved one single, central, perfect autographic manuscript. Imagine it was kept locked in a vault, controlled by a centralized religious hierarchy like the Roman magisterium or an imperial court.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
If that singular hierarchy decided they wanted to alter a theological point to suit their political needs, they could literally pull the master text out of the vault, rewrite the sentence, and lock it back up.
No one would ever be able to detect the alteration because there would be no external copies to compare it against. Centralization creates the opportunity for absolute undetectable corruption.
But by scattering thousands of copies across completely different geographic regions, pushing manuscripts into Antioch, down into Alexandria, over to Rome, and up to Constantinople, the text becomes unhackable.
It acts like an ancient analog blockchain.
That is an excellent modern parallel. In a blockchain, the ledger is distributed across thousands of nodes. If one node is hacked, the rest of the network rejects it because their ledgers don't match.
In the ancient world, if a local scribe in Alexandria accidentally skipped a line or deliberately tried to change a verse in the year 200, that missing line didn't magically disappear from the manuscripts currently circulating over in Antioch or Rome.
The error was geographically isolated. It was quarantined to that specific copy.
So, because we have this massive volume and geographic diversity, modern textual critics can lay these manuscripts side by side on a table and instantly spot the anomaly.
Instantly. This completely neutralizes the primary argument of secular textual critics. Skeptics frequently point to the hundreds of thousands of minor spelling variations and skip lines between all these copies and claim the text is a chaotic mess that cannot be trusted.
They see the spelling errors and assume the original message is lost, but they are misinterpreting the evidence.
They are entirely missing the mechanical reality of the transmission. The high volume of minor variations is not proof of corruption. It is the exact diagnostic data that allows the Church to restore the primary text.
By comparing the geographic text families, scholars can trace the lineage of an error, see exactly where and when a scribe's eye skipped a line, and isolate it with absolute precision.
The thousands of minor variations are the very mechanism that proves the core text is secure, thoroughly rejecting the skepticism of liberal critics.
Having seen the historical mechanics of how the text survived, from papyrus reeds beaten with mallets to animal skins scraped with knives to the brilliant decentralized preservation, we now have to look at what the text actually demands of its readers.
Because fighting to preserve a text is only half the story. If you preserve it but ignore what it says, the history is useless.
We have to pivot to the theological core found in Paul's second letter to Timothy and the urgent binding call to preach.
To grasp the weight of 2 Timothy, you must understand the physical and historical setting of the author. Paul is not writing a casual theological treatise while sitting comfortably in a warm study.
He is writing from the dark, damp, freezing depths of the Mamertine prison in Rome.
The year is around 67 AD. The Emperor Nero is on the throne, orchestrating brutal campaigns against the Christians.
Paul is chained in a dungeon, facing his own imminent execution. He knows his life is ending, and from that dark cell he writes his final letter to his young protege Timothy, who is laboring as a pastor in the city of Ephesus.
And Paul's primary charge to Timothy is to continue in the sacred writings.
In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 through 17, Paul outlines the theological dynamic between inspiration and transmission. He states that all Scripture is God-breathed.
The theological terms historically applied here are plenary, meaning the entirety of the Scripture is breathed out. Verbal, meaning the very words themselves, not just the broad concepts, are inspired.
And organic, meaning God didn't dictate the text like a robot, but used the distinct personalities, vocabularies, and historical contexts of the human authors.
And there is a very crucial theological distinction we have to clarify here, connecting our history of manuscripts to this theology of inspiration.
The original autographic text, the literal papyrus sheet that Paul actually signed his name to in that prison cell, is what is immediately and perfectly inspired by God.
The thousands of later copies we just discussed, with their minor spelling errors and scriptio continua, are authoritative insofar as they faithfully represent that original God-breathed text.
That's right. The original autographs are the locus of inspiration. And Paul tells Timothy the purpose of these writings. They're designed to make one wise for salvation through faith in Christ.
The text has an intense Christological focus. It presents Jesus fulfilling his distinct mediatorial roles.
As the prophet, declaring the ultimate truth of God. As the priest, offering himself as the final perfect sacrifice. And as the king, ruling and governing his people entirely through his written word.
But Paul doesn't stop with a beautiful description of the text's nature. He moves immediately into a severe, terrifying warning in chapter 4, verses 1 through 5.
He details the anatomy of apostasy.
The Greek verb Paul uses to charge Timothy in chapter 4 is an intensive, solemn command. He essentially places Timothy under oath.
He tells him, I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead.
He places the young pastor squarely under the gaze of the coming judge. And then he warns him that a time is coming when congregations will develop itching ears.
Itching ears. It is such a vivid, almost grotesque phrase. What does that actually look like in a congregation?
It is defined as an obsessive internal desire for self-affirmation. It is a craving for theological novelty and a strict preference for entertaining fables over difficult, confronting truths.
It is a deliberate, conscious turning away from sound, objective doctrine.
When a congregation develops itching ears, they don't just abandon religion, they seek out teachers who will flatter their desires.
They want someone in the pulpit who will affirm their lifestyle rather than confront their fins. The apostasy begins when the appetite for clear, objective theological truth is replaced by a relentless demand for subjective comfort.
I have to ask this because it seems like a massive contradiction in modern church culture.
What's that?
If we have this perfectly preserved, God-breathed text, fought for through centuries of freezing scribal labor, scraped animal skins, and martyrdom, why do so many modern pulpits sound more like a corporate TED Talk or a therapeutic self-help seminar than a declaration of truth?
That's a great question. Paul addresses that exact failure by giving Timothy crisp, imperative commands to combat the cultural drift. Paul tells Timothy to herald the text.
The Greek word implies a public crier delivering an authoritative message from a reigning king.
A herald doesn't hold an open dialogue to ask the crowd what they think of the king's edict. And a herald certainly doesn't alter the king's message to make it more palatable or less offensive to the listeners.
The text demands that the minister be ready in season and out of season.
That means standing in the pulpit and preaching the objective truth even when the surrounding culture entirely rejects it, even when it is wildly unpopular. Paul commands him to reprove, rebuke, and exhort.
This is a complete structural rejection of modern seeker-sensitive pragmatism. The true faithful watchman cannot rely on orchestrating subjective emotional encounters.
They cannot rely on trying to be culturally relevant or amusing. They must rely exclusively on the objective exegesis of the text.
The sole authority lies in the word itself, not in the charisma of the speaker, the production value of the music, or the entertainment value of the Sunday service.
Which brings us right back to where we started our conversation today. The brutal physical history of the text, the papyrus reeds, the caustic lime vats, the iron gall ink, the thousands of massive parchment codices, it all leads directly to this moment of public proclamation.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the history of the New Testament, it becomes overwhelmingly clear that the physical history of the book is actually a summons to deeper reverence.
It is a history that vividly demonstrates that the text was carried through the centuries by the Father's meticulous providence.
It reveals a text that remains centered entirely on the Son's gospel, and it is a text that is actively applied to the hearts of the hearers by the Spirit.
The physical wear and tear of those ancient manuscripts points directly to the relentless, sovereign effort to keep the voice of the shepherd available to the flock, no matter the cost.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Please do.
The next time you sit down in a pew and open a printed Bible, or the next time you casually tap a verse on your phone screen while waiting in line for coffee, pause for just a second.
Look at the page. Consider that the very blank spaces between the words you are reading, the little chapter numbers floating in the margins, and the translated sentences are not just modern conveniences.
They are the direct result of centuries of calloused hands, scribes working by candlelight with freezing ink, horrific labor-scraping animal skins, and intense, exhausting intellectual labor.
All of that gritty, bloody, physical history was guided by a sovereign God, ensuring that you would hear his voice today.
So that pristine, untouchable artifact sitting under the bulletproof glass in the museum, it might look perfect and clean, but the true treasure is the text that has survived the dirt, the fire, and the centuries to finally reach your hands.